Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My task is to discuss ethics and regulatory controls to govern the use of live animals in research and education. It's a privilege to be the last one to speak because the previous speakers have covered most of the technical issues I would have dealt with. So basically, I'm mainly going to focus on the law. Although in passing, I need to re-emphasize again that even as the laws regulating ethics in education and research in this country, there is this fundamental awareness that animals are sentient and therefore they should be handled humanely. It has also been mentioned about the OIE guidelines on animal welfare that states that the animals have the right to the 5 freedoms. Now, Kenya is continually updating its laws to comply with OIE guidelines. In view of the fact that Kenya is a member of the WTO, the genesis for us to have the OIE and its guidelines. Animal welfare, as far as Kenya is concerned, is entrenched in the Constitution. That forms the basis for the laws to safeguard animal welfare during training, during vet practice, animal husbandry, research, and other socio-cultural activities. According to the law that puts Kenya Veterinary Board in place, Section 6 of the Veterinary Surgeons and Veterinary Paraprofessionals Act, the Kenya Veterinary Board is a leading agency in the regulation of animal welfare in this country. It is a requirement that every veterinary surgeon or veterinary paraprofessional in this country, they have to take an oath to safeguard animal welfare. This oath is taken upon graduation, and it is a prerequisite for them to be registered or even licensed by the Kenya Veterinary Board to practice. For instance, participating in veterinary education or even conducting veterinary research. Now, Kenya Veterinary Board is alive to the fact that knowledge in animal welfare, not the requirement for animal welfare, the knowledge in animal welfare is dynamic, and therefore it keeps updating the laws and regulations to safeguard this animal welfare. As a way of background, we looked at some papers which have been published. There is Kimwele et al., who stated that undergraduate veterinary and medical education facilities use animal dissections for anatomical illustrations and isolate organs to use for physiological demonstrations, and all animals are used for demonstrating surgical techniques. With this in the back of the mind, I very specifically appreciate what Professor Enande presented, those alternatives he was talking about. We have the Consortium for National Health Research that states that recognizing that animal welfare is a value of the Kenyan state as enshrined in the Constitution of Kenya 2010, the national guidelines on laboratory animal science acknowledge and affirm that sufficient scientific knowledge is available to guide and ensure animal welfare. We also have a citation here by Professor Kiama from the International Council for Laboratory Animal Scientific Working Group that states that all personnel involved with the use of animals in research, testing, and teaching should be adequately educated, trained, and qualified in the principles of laboratory animal research and the ethical considerations of animal use, and they should have demonstrable knowledge and expertise in the specific animal procedures proposed on the species to be used. And ladies and gentlemen, some of these statements that I've cited there were taken into account when we were formulating the rules or the guidelines or the regulations that are necessary for people participating in veterinary education and veterinary research, as I will illustrate in a short while. Now, regarding laboratory animals in education and research, the OIE studies recommend the use of appropriate conditions of animal health and welfare management and in respect of the international accepted 3 hours that Dr. Maina talked about a short while ago. The Veterinary Surgeons and Veterinary Paraprofessional Act, Section 6.2f, states that the Kenya Veterinary Board shall formulate and publish a code of ethics which shall be binding on all registered persons. And I'm going to shed some more light on where this ethics, the ethical requirements when it comes to veterinary education and veterinary research. The Code of Ethics for Veterinary Professionals and Veterinary Paraprofessionals, Rule number 25.1, states that a veterinary surgeon or a veterinary paraprofessional involved in research using animals shall adhere with the national legislation, which includes Chapter 360 of the laws of Kenya. Cap 360 is a law which is for protection of cruelty, or the prevention of cruelty to animals. Section 13 to 23, those sections are very elaborate on what may be done, what may not be done according to the laws. And it is a requirement for every veterinary surgeon, as mentioned, a veterinary professional in this country, to be aware of the law. And also, there is the OI guidelines, Article 7.1 on animal welfare, on the use of animals in research. And then also to ensure that the highest standards of management, handling, and analgesia are used at all times, where we must do to the animals things that are likely to be painful, considering the standards that have been mentioned by Dr. Maina, the issues of pain, we use anesthesia, if really we must use those animals. And the rule number 25.2 states that without prejudice to paragraph 1, a veterinary surgeon and veterinary paraprofessional shall ensure that an animal is only used in cases where there are no alternative methods, including utilization of cells, tissues, or organs of animals, may be used to obtain similar results. And of course, with a contribution from Professor Nandi, that also now gives us another opportunity here. It is a requirement that care is taken to use fewer animals to obtain comparable levels of information or to obtain more information from the same number of animals. Let us be reminded that these laws were formed when some of these alternatives were not available. But our laws are very conscious about the sentient nature of animals, and therefore that's what guided this. Now, the methods used need to prevent, alleviate, or minimize pain, suffering, distress, or lasting harm, and enhance welfare of the animal used. A veterinary surgeon or veterinary paraprofessional shall undertake regular training to update themselves on the humane handling of animals. It is a requirement in this country that for a veterinary surgeon to remain in the register or for a veterinary paraprofessional, they shall acquire a stated minimum continuous professional development points or credit factors. And those CPDs, part of it has a lot to do with animal welfare. And as a board, as a regulatory body, we encourage those stakeholders who are involved in animal welfare to conduct CPD activities that are highlighting, that are building the capacity of our professionals and paraprofessionals to align themselves to these requirements. A veterinary surgeon or veterinary paraprofessional shall actively discourage research work using animals where the research is unnecessarily repetitive or has ill-defined goals, and shall, whenever possible, encourage the substitution of in vivo with in vitro techniques. Now, let us look at some of the laws that we have that control the use of animals. We have mentioned Cap 360. 360.3.1, Section 3.1 states that a person shall be guilty of an offense of cruelty if he cruelly does these things. I highlighted ill-treats because in the course of research, people who are insensitive may unnecessarily ill-treat the animals. It is not only a violation of the Code of Ethics for the professionals, but anybody else who is not under the Code of Ethics for the veterinarians will have committed an offense if he is shown to have done this. Some methods can torture the animals. Some methods can terrify the animals. It is the basis of what you've heard Dr. Mwenda talking about, the concern at the IPR and things like that. Uses an animal which is so diseased, injured, or in such physical condition that it is unfit to be used. We are aware that some people who are insensitive have actually done this to fellow human beings. And if this happens to fellow human beings during research, as happened several years ago in some parts of Europe, imagine what a negligent or ignorant person could do to an animal. Therefore, it is criminalized in our laws. Or conveys, carries, and confines or impounds an animal in a manner or position which causes the animal unnecessary suffering. Dr. Mwenda has told you that the government itself, that's its bait to lead, or rather to walk its talk, because this is in our laws. That's why the IPR does what it does. And it is the responsibility of the Kenya Veterinary Board inspectors to inspect and find out if there are situations of research or education where animals are subjected to such situations. Without sufficient cause, starves or feeds or denies water to an animal. This could bring debate. It implies that you may not conduct starving experiments on animals, and so on. Being the owner of an animal without reasonable excuse or cause abandons it, whether permanently or not, in circumstances likely to cause the animal unnecessary suffering. Sometimes somebody has finished their research program, they had some rats, they don't care, they're sitting in the lab. That's criminalized, or whichever animal is being used for that matter. Being the owner of an animal keeps it in a grossly dirty or verminous condition or without reasonable excuse or a cause, fails to procure or administer veterinary treatment or attention for the animal in case of disease, injury, or delivery of the young. Ladies and gentlemen, some researchers are not necessarily veterinarians. That's why we have this law, general law, which is not binding the veterinarians only. But if this happens, then it is a responsibility for the institution to take care of such issues. Subjects an animal to veterinary surgery in contravention of the VSVP Act. It implies whoever you are and you're doing research and you're not a veterinarian, if there has to be surgery, then that requires to be done by a surgeon, whatever you're investigating. Being the owner of an animal without reasonable cause or excuse does or omits to do an act which causes unnecessary suffering to the animal. Now, control of practice. We have the Act. We are talking about practice, and the practice is defined. Now, Section 13.1 states that no person shall practice or hold himself out, whether directly or indirectly, as practicing or being able to practice a veterinary surgeon or a veterinary professional to take up employment as such, unless he is registered and licensed under this Act, and that licensing and registration is done by the Kenya Veterinary Board. Now, practice includes training in animal health or conducting veterinary research. Section 38 of the same law says that any person who employs a veterinary surgeon or veterinary professional who is not registered under this Act or contravenes any of the provisions of this Act commits an offense and shall be liable upon conviction to a fine not exceeding 100,000 Kenya shillings, which is the equivalent of $1,000, around $1,000, or to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 12 months, or to both, depending on the decision of the court. The use of animals in vet training may risk violating of animal welfare due to the student's ignorance. For instance, injury to the animals or stress to the animals due to the fear, either by the animals or by the student. This may happen during manipulative handling, administration of medicines, breeding, not bleeding, breeding, where I come from we have an issue with L, breeding or surgery, or too many students per animal because of the challenge of stressful fatigue to the animal or even injury to the animal. Now the cure for this in our law, in our veterinary surgeons, veterinary professionals Act 366 section 45.1 requires the Cabinet Secretary, that is the Minister, through the Kenya Veterinary Board, to develop regulations for standards to be adhered to, including during training. And some of those regulations, for example, the regulation used for approving institutions that train in animal health or veterinary medicine, sub-rule 3 states that a person or institution shall not offer training in animal health or veterinary medicine unless they are registered by the Kenya Veterinary Board. Regulation 33, standards for training in institutions, states in sub-rule 1F the minimum standard of a ratio of at least 2 animals per student admission for cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs, and 1 flock of 200 poultry for 10 student admission, and at least a fish farm and a rabbit farm. For them to get licensed, they must have at least this taken care of. Takes care of sufficient exposure of the students, but also addresses issues of animal welfare to avoid overstressing, overhandling of the animals. Regulations Article 3, Subgroup 4, the institution shall meet the following additional requirements. The lecturers for animal health courses shall be veterinary surgeons. Remember what I said was talked about, the guidelines, that people shall have sufficient knowledge about the species, about the animals. The lecturers shall possess relevant qualifications for the subjects they teach. The head of the faculty or school shall be a veterinary surgeon. He has to be a veterinary surgeon because if the institution violates any of the laws, the state may take criminal action against him or her, but the board will take disciplinary action against him for violating any of the rules of the Veterinary Surgeons, Veterinary Professionals Act. The heads of veterinary academic sections shall be veterinary surgeons for the same reasons. Coming to finish. Now, Regulation 11.6b states that an inspector from the Veterinary Inspectorate of the Kenya Veterinary Board shall have authority to conduct inspections for the purposes of safeguarding animal welfare by confirming the status of any premises where animals are kept or handled in any way are being adhered to. In conclusion, the recognition of the fact that knowledge in the area of animal welfare is dynamic makes it necessary to keep upholding or updating the laws and regulations that safeguard it. I expect that out of these outputs, if there are contributions that are sufficient to cause the Kenya Veterinary Board to review any of its regulations, I could give you assurance that that shall be done. Now, the KVB, that shows you that the Kenya Veterinary Board is alive to the fact that knowledge in this area is quite dynamic. Now, from a moral perspective, we find a lot of people saying that animals were created for man to use the way they want. The Quran says something different. The Quran 55:10 says, "And the earth he assigned to all living creatures." It's not for human beings, it is to all living creatures. And then if you look at the Bible, Proverbs 12:10, "A righteous man regards the life of his beast, but the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel." Now, finally, according to the Constitution, not according to me, according to the Constitution, Kenya is a God-fearing nation, and so the above verses are reflected in our laws, as I hope I've demonstrated. Thank you very much.